Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar on building fairness into meaningful work. We are joined today, Nic Marks, founder and CEO of Friday Pulse, is leading our webinar as normal, and we're joined today by Andrew Soren, who's founder and CEO of Eudaimonic by Design. We'll be asking you a few questions as we go, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions for Nic or Andrew or both of them, please do add your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those as we go or at the end. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Angela. Angela been monitoring the chat and the Q&A, but it would be really lovely if people put in the chat where you're coming from. And then you had a question for them, didn't you, Andrew? Are you on mute, I think?
Yes, I sure am. Yes. The slight details. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to be able to have you here. My question for you is, what does meaningful work mean to you? That is an opening volley of a question to the audience that is live with us today. What does meaningful work mean to you? I'll post that into the chat.
Great. So yeah, so put it to that. What does meaningful work mean to you? That would be great. So while we're just gathering some answers to that, I'm just going to do a little framing to our talk today. So the idea of the webinar is, and calling it Just Meaning, is that sometimes meaningful work is almost exploited in the marketplace. That, you know, if you've got meaning, you know, do you have fairness? So we want to look at the interaction between those two. So first things to do, I want to just put up the model, which some of you who've been to my webinars before might be familiar with, but I call it a dynamic model of team happiness. It's quite a busy diagram going on, but take your attention firstly to the middle, which is the aim is to build happy teams. If you go to the right, they build successes. So we know that happier teams retain team members better, they attract better quality team members to them, they have less sickness absence, less stress, less burnout, they're more creative, they have more productivity, they're more resilient, and ultimately they generate great business value. So happy teams are worth building, and happiness and success tend to go along. But to the left of the diagram, you'll see the things that build happy teams, and particularly the 5 ways to team happiness: connect, relationships, be fair, empower, challenge, and inspire. And you can pretty much immediately see that, you know, we've got fairness and we've got inspire, which is basically meaning. If I look at these a bit more carefully, just this is really we're going to concentrate on this side of the diagram, though I absolutely know that Andrew's going to talk about some of the right-hand side, the successes that come from having meaningful and fair work, or particularly meaningful. Andrew's an expert on meaning, that's what the word eudaimonia means, isn't it, in a way? Yeah,
it sure does, in some ways.
Yeah. So so we're really going to look, this is just showing the beta correlations. I'm a statistician, so what are the drivers and how weighty are they? When you put a regression analysis looking at happy teams, all of these enter the equations, but the strongest two you can see here are be fair and inspire. Okay, they've got the strongest drivers of it. They're all important. Relationships are really, really critical to building good teams, but actually most teams have relatively good relationships. So when you look at the stats of it, it's not driving the difference between teams so much. The reason that fairness drives it so much is not only its critical importance, it's foundational, but also that there's more variation between teams. So actually it's explaining more of the variance. And the same with meaning, inspire, okay? They're all important, but inspire and be fair become really important because they're the vision and they're the foundation, if you like, of the two things. So, you know, that's what we're going to focus on right now is be fair and inspire. And later I'm going to show a few more stats on that, but I'm going to hand across to Andrew now to introduce us to his work, because I'm really excited, actually. Andrew and I don't know, we've known each other a couple of years, and every time I have a conversation with him, I come away learning something. And he is, well, you should introduce yourself, but he is I should have had a spiel here to introduce you, Andrew, but he's the founder and CEO of Eudaimonic by Design. But even, you come from an academic background. You also are on the board of the International Positive Psychology Association, and in fact is one of the main organizers of the conference coming up. Or perhaps we should look at the chat first. What do you think, Andrew? Should I stop sharing and we have a look at?
Yeah, let's have a quick look. And thank you, Nick. I'll just say it's a pleasure to be able to be here. And I gotta say, I really love Nic Marks and everything that you do, Nick. I've been a huge fan of your work back since you were working in policy around well-being, and all of the ways in which you've thought and challenged this field to really think holistically around what the drivers and the relationships between different kinds of well-being actually are in our lives and now in our work. I've had the great opportunity to work with clients with Friday Pulse itself, and I'm a huge fan of the tool, and more importantly, the way that I think that your tool drives conversation around happiness at work. And in fact, I think that that's actually a good introduction to kind of what it is that we're talking about today. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of different things in the chat that have come through. I'll just read some of them out loud. So the question that I posed to folks in the chat was, what does meaningful work mean to you? And there's some great different answers. So job satisfaction, enjoying your job, feedback, being able to contribute my best self, improving the well-being of others, an excitement that makes me actually want to come into the office or log in from home every morning, worthwhile work that keeps you engaged and motivated, work that helps others, that challenges me intellectually, that reflects my values. These are wonderful, wonderful descriptions of what meaningful work is. Maybe I'll use them to just launch right into some of the content that I'm going to be talking about. You said that I run a company that's called Eudaimonic by Design. Eudaimonia is this beautiful ancient Greek word that is kind of untranslatable. The etymology of it in and of itself, if you were to really break it down, is you, which means good, and daimon, which means spirit or demon or God that might live within all of us. So the idea that within all of us there is this good spirit that is driving towards something. And this is a word that Aristotle and many of the classical philosophers would have used as one way of describing what a life well lived was. In fact, Aristotle would not have said these words, but if I were to interpret Aristotle in the context of what we're here to talk about today, he might have said something like, a eudaimonic life at work is one where you're able to bring the very best of yourself to do something meaningful in the world, to do meaningful, worthwhile, significant work in the world, whatever that work is for you. Sometimes he described it a little bit like an acorn. So if you found an acorn in the forest, and within that acorn lies the potential for there to be a mighty oak tree. That acorn, that potential exists within all of us. And the question is, what are the contexts? What are the external contexts? What are the enabling resources? What are the personal resources required to turn that acorn into a mighty oak? It might contain all of the essential ingredients, but it doesn't just happen. You need to actually create the conditions to make it happen. And this is, of course, why I love Friday Pulse, because I think that's what Friday Pulse is all about. How do we create mighty oak trees of any team by ultimately understanding the 5 whys of happiness? So that's.
I guess that other types of tree are available too.
Other types of tree are available. Yes, we don't need just oak trees. It's true. Yeah, good point. All of this maybe drives me into this conversation that we're having today. So I've been thinking about this idea of eudaimonia for a long time. I've studied it. I work at the University of Pennsylvania in this field of positive psychology, which really is about the scientific exploration of things like eudaimonia. And I started working with this extraordinary psychologist whose name is Carol Riff. And Carol is one of probably the most important researchers in the topic of eudaimonic well-being, eudaimonia as specifically considered from a scientific perspective. What does that actually mean? What does it look like? And she would very much argue that that at its core, a lot of what eudaimonia is about is a sense of meaning and purpose. And so that, in the context of my work, became an explanation of what it was that I was trying to understand. And so Carol and I have actually just been writing this paper that's about to be published, and that we'll speak a little bit about at the World Congress on Positive Psychology that's happening in July. I'll do a bit of a plug of that later. So this is a preview of some kind of hot, not even on the presses yet, research that we've been doing to try to understand what is meaningful work and what does the impact of meaningful work have on us as individuals and as an organization. So first we have to start with definitions. There's lots of literature on this topic of meaningful work. And actually one of the things that's interesting is that people define meaningful work in lots of different ways. There's lots of different ways you could talk about it. You could talk about purpose, you could talk about passion, you could talk about a calling. But the broadest definition of meaningful work is work that is personally significant and worthwhile. And what you see when you dig into the research, I just saw the note in the chat about the flow behind me. Yes. Meaningful work is part of flow too. Flow is part of meaningful work. What meaningful work is when you dive into the literature is really quite holistic. It's about the actual things we do on a day-to-day basis. It's about the roles that we play in the workplace. It's about the interactions that we have with other people, whether internally facing, externally facing. It's also about the organization itself, the kind of values the organization holds, the purpose the organization holds, what we're doing in the world. Meaningful work really shows up across all of these different domains. And the first thing that Carol and I tried to do was try to just understand how much work has actually been done in meaningful work. And it turns out that there's actually quite a lot of research that's been done on meaningful work over the last 20, 30 years. This starts from the 70s, and you can see very little tiny bits of research that were starting to emerge in the 1970s and 80s. But really around the turn of the 21st century, you start to see these spikes in exponential growth around the interest of this topic of meaningful work. In fact, this is very much a zeitgeist. Half of all published studies on meaningful work have been published since 2019. So there's just an immense increase in the amount of how meaningful work is being considered and what it looks like. And there's kind of a good reason for that. A lot of that's because it turns out that meaningful work is really good for us. It's really good for our organizations. It's really good for our well-being. When we are experiencing meaningful work, we tend to feel more committed to the organizations we're part of. We tend to be more engaged both personally as well as the work that we're in. We have better citizenship behaviors, which means that we're basically, better people at work. We're kinder, we're more other focused. We have higher job satisfaction. We're more creative and innovative. We have lower absenteeism, less sick days. We have lower intentions to quit our organizations. We want to stick around for longer. All of that seems to create this upward spiral of well-being that I think, Nic, your research really tries to underpin and make a connection around this fact that when we have all of these good conditions swirling around, that tends to create this upward cycle of positivity, increased well-being. We just feel better at work, and work becomes a better place. Let me just pause, Nic. Is there anything that you want to add to this equation? Because I know this is work that you've seen in protocols.
Yeah, so I mean, this slide is not dissimilar to the one I put about the 7 successes. So you can obviously see them there. But one of the things that I've really noticed when I'm doing surveys and I'm designing questions is that people struggle to know what you mean by the word meaningful. And so I use the word that you did there, worthwhile, a lot. So because it seems to be that something that people can connect to, across the board. I don't know whether you found that too.
Yeah, I think that what significant and worthwhile are probably those two most used words that often help us understand and unpack what does What does meaning mean? I think that different people, there's a guy named Mike Steger who would say that if you really unpacked meaning, it probably boils down into three major things. One is just about significance. Like, is the work that I'm doing important in the world? Like, that's one thing. Two is congruence, which is really a sense of, is it aligned to the values that I hold in some way? Is there, and I saw some of that within the chat too. Do I feel like I'm able to work is meaningful when it feels like it's a reflection of my true or authentic self? And then the third real element is purpose. Am I moving towards an important goal? Do I have something that I'm moving towards? All three of those things, I think, are part of what that worthwhileness is all about.
So what do you think about contribution? Because I often think about, because we often talk in the well-being literature about attention or complementarity between pleasure and meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And this might be hack-eyed, I don't know, but I think of pleasure as coming towards me and meaning going from me, that it's about a contribution, it's a give and take in Adam Grant's terms. But I'm just wondering whether you think that meaningful work has to be other focused.
I think that much of the literature would say that it is other focused, that when it's hard to find meaning in a purely self-focused way, that there's so much of what meaning is that's about other people in some way, shape, or form, a pro-sociality, a striving towards a greater good in some context. So I think that's a very true thing to say. I will say, though, and I think that this, where I'm going next, is it's not always pleasurable. I think that's an interesting thing. So it's a case in point. There's lots of different people who study meaning in all sorts of ways. And as I said, there's much of the research is all about all of the great things that come with meaningful work. But there was this wonderful paper that was published in 2009 by Bunderstein and Thompson that's called The Call of the Wild. And it's all about zookeepers. And it was quite brilliant paper that studied zookeepers all throughout North America. And now zookeepers in general see their work as deeply meaningful. They would many of them articulate their work as a calling. They really feel called to do this work. There are literally animals that live or die based on the zookeepers' efforts. And the even more interesting thing about the zookeepers is that many zoos have animals that are in extinction, in the face of extinction within their keep. And so literally, if a zookeeper doesn't do their job well, they might be responsible for the extinction of an entire species. So there's a high moral stake in what they do. Many zookeepers, according to this research, are quite obsessed with their work. They will work overtime, they'll work on nights, they'll work on weekends, whatever it takes, especially if there is a deep need within the animals under their care. And many would say they would do this work even if they weren't paid for it. That's how important it is. The interesting thing about Bunderson and Thompson's work is that it seems that other people noticed they would do all these things. The management of zoos noticed they would do all these things, and they tended to be exploited. Zookeepers talked about the fact that they were notoriously underpaid, and they are relative to other industries. They are asked to work nights and weekends in ways that are not necessarily compensated for, and they're pushed to extremes because they will do it, is kind of the answer. And so this article was one of the first articles that I saw that started to talk about a dark side of meaningful work. And that was something that was really interesting to me, because in the experiences that I've had doing work with people who find their work deeply meaningful, there often is this tension where people who see their work as deeply meaningful are pushing boundaries in a ways that feel like their well-being is actually being challenged. And so I started to do more digging. And it turns out that that's actually true across the board. There's actually a fair bit of research now that says that for those who see their work as deeply meaningful, and this is true in all sorts of sectors, whether it's firefighters, whether it's educators, whether it's nurses, doctors, whether it's international aid workers, folks who work in the nonprofit, non-governmental sector, as well as people who work in corporations who just see their work as deeply and importantly meaningful, they tend to have a higher moral stake in what they're doing, just like those zookeepers. They have that kind of creates what's described in the literature as boundary inhibition, which means that they stop seeing a divide between work and home. Those divides that in some ways often protect our well-being get eroded. That can damage interpersonal relationships. There's an obsession. There's this wonderful literature on passion, and we can be passionate. We can have a harmonious passion, but we can also very much have obsessive passion that starts to erode our well-being. People who are find their work deeply meaningful, especially those who are doing social impact work, will actually accept less pay. They go into a job candidate, for example, will go into a setting expecting that because their work is for the greater good, they don't actually need to get paid as much. That often connects with some sort of exploitation that exists within the organization. All of that tends to create this downward spiral of negative emotions, the biggest one being regret. And all of that tends to wind up connecting to a sense of lower life satisfaction and this downward spiral of increased stress and eventually burnout within the literature. And just pause there. Nic, thoughts, comments?
I'll tell you what, so I was really interested in this harmonious passion and obsessive passion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I think that's the thing, is how do we bring things into harmony, isn't it? That's one of the big things we're trying to do with well-being. It's never a sort of maximizing space. It's always optimizing and trade-offs and complementarities, synergies. But yeah, I don't know where. Yeah, but anyway, the zookeeping stuff is fascinating. As soon as you told me about that when we were having a call about this, I said, oh yeah, that's because it's like, it's an unusual industry to talk about. No one really talks, you know, we talk about healthcare and other things being this and not for profit, but zookeepers, you can really see it, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that work around harmonious versus obsessive passion, the academic who does the most work in that regard is a guy named Bob Valorant in Montreal. Brilliant man. But it's complicated. This same thing, this same passion can really lead to two different directions. And I think that that's really what this meaningful work is about too. Meaningful work itself could lead into two different directions, but it kind of depends on the context in which you find yourself doing it.
Yeah.
I think that starts to get us into a little bit of a question of the organizational piece. And it's interesting because there's a lot of just emphasis that organizations have, especially these days. There's this zeitgeist of meaning. There's a lot of focus on social impact. And so meaning is often used as a way of organizations thinking about driving motivation, around driving performance, around driving commitment to a brand or an organization. But that can have this pernicious consequence. And different social theorists have called this different things. And some of these words I love: the colonization of consciousness, or the symbolic manipulation of meaning, or the governing of the soul. There's different ways of being able to talk about this active work of working to use meaning, sometimes against people, for the purposes of the organization. And I think that if we just take a broader look at just some of the big things that have been happening in the context of the workforce, especially post-pandemic, we see some of that potentially coming to bear in things like the Great Resignation. The Great Resignation, as I'm sure everybody on this call is aware, was really something that emerged in 2021 as organizations were starting to come out of lockdowns, and companies couldn't find the workers who were in previously kind of pretty crappy jobs that existed, it was hard to be able to get those jobs back, especially low wage jobs, especially amongst younger people, especially in certain sectors like hospitality or service sectors that were a little bit challenging. So that's really what the Great Resignation, and as I say, there we go. And this was different than other times. I mean, there have definitely been other big macroeconomic, times, whether it was the Great Recession of 2008 or the dot-com bust of 2001, where something similar happened, but this was actually qualitatively different and quantitatively different when actually folks looked at the stats and the longer term impact of this Great Resignation. There was also this quiet quitting phenomenon that became kind of the talk of 2022, where people seemed to be opting out of tasks, doing less than what they were being asked to do, feeling like they were disengaged or disillusioned, psychologically less invested in their work. And of course, this isn't a new thing. There's lots of different ways of talking about quiet quitting that have existed over the years, but it seemed to be impacting a lot of people. Gallup was reporting that up to 50% of the workforce in 2022 was feeling this quiet quitting. So again, this question of, what might be going on here? Is it possible that quiet quitting and the Great Resignation might be consequences of something, and or might actually be some sort of job action that people were taking? There's this wonderful MIT Sloan article that got published at the beginning of this year that talked about these things as calibrated contribution. At least in the US, in the US, the minimum wage is at the lowest point adjusted for inflation and other things like that in 66 years. The CEO to average worker pay was 670 to 1 in 2020.
And that is a shocking stat.
The US now reflects the same levels of income inequality that we typically see in quote unquote underdeveloped or undeveloped or extremely corrupt countries in the world. Unions are at their lowest point of participation since 1955. And of course, labor unions are the things that would help worker rights in different kinds of ways. And there's no significant federal legislations to actually improve worker rights that are in sight, especially in the US, and the extreme kind of conflict between the divides that exist right there. So this question has really come up of, it feels like there's a lot of unfairness going on. And in the context of that, let me just one last thing. In the context of that unfairness is it possible that just by doing less work or by choosing to get out of my job at all, that's actually something that allows me to feel like I'm having meaning? Like I can actually make a choice, even if it means doing less of work. Sorry, I'll stop now.
No, I was just saying, I feel pretty down on Britain at the moment, but you made me feel a bit better there.
Let me stop there for a second if I can. There we go. Just in terms of this might be a good time to just kind of look at some of your slides.
Yeah, and so I'm going to do a few slides now, but I'd really like people, if you've got a question for Andrew further, I see there's one there and we'll come back to that in a minute, but if you've got a further question for Andrew about that, and then I'm going to show a few stats on actually how we sit with the interaction between fairness and meaning, and also we will have space for some questions at the end, but we can do something that's going on. So as I said, both fairness and we call it inspire, but it's the same thing, meaning are important. But another way of looking at it is this interaction. So I often think about things as 2x2 grids. So if I'd like you all just to think for yourselves now, you can put it in the chat if you want to, but do you feel that your role you have at the moment has high or low meaning? So think of that. Do you feel it's worthwhile, or do you feel it's any sort of okay? Don't make it even low, because meaningless is really, really, really low. But if you just feel it could be more, you can put yourself towards the low if you want to. Do you think you're treated fairly at work? Are you treated with respect? Is your pay considering your contribution? So just think there whether you feel your job is really meaningful, whether it's very fair. Which quadrant would you sit in if you looked at these quadrants here? So while you're thinking about that, I'll give you some stats. So the first thing I'm going to show you, like, we just recently done a benchmark survey in the UK. It was a representative sample of 1,500 people. And, I asked them questions that I can do this categorization in, but I then look at how many people are happy in each of these quadrants. And basically what you can see is that the miserable jobs down the bottom left are pretty miserable. Only 16% of people report being happy if they've said they've got low meaning and low fairness. It's pretty equal between them. So obviously high meaning, high fairness is much the best. 86% of people feel the job's meaningful. It's both of the other two are sort of 50%. It's sort of almost a trade-off between the two of them, that it seems to go on whether they report they're happy or not. So that's just some stats there. The next thing is highly stressed. And what you can see there is that, yes, the miserable jobs are highly stressed, but the ones with high meaning and low fairness are even slightly more stressed. They're 43% of them reporting high stress as opposed to 41%. Whereas low meaning and high fairness is only a third of them. And there's stress in all jobs. There's still a quarter, 27% in the high meaning. But that's kind of interesting that the high meaning, low fairness are more stressful. I mean, we'll be on the edge of statistical significance with that, but it's definitely indicative that they're at least at a parallel. You can also look at whether they're burnt out. So I put this question as straightforward as I could do, which was to define burnout. And I said, do you think you've suffered from burnout over the last year? No, maybe, yes. This is just the yeses, taking out the maybes. I always give people an option to give me a soft yes or a soft no. But if you definitely feel you're burnt out, you've been burnt out last year. And you can again see that both the miserable and the low fairness jobs, both the low fairness jobs are the ones where the burnout is. If you've got high fairness and low meaning, you're more likely still to. And again, the best jobs have got the lowest. So you're seeing that, it's actually pretty bad to have high meaning and low fairness. And then you can look at intention to quit. Again, the most miserable are most likely to quit. And actually, this was higher than I expected in high meaning and low fairness, because actually some people who are very purpose driven, they don't actually have the time to look for another job because they're sort of very full on. Whereas if you've got sort of low meaning, then you might have more time to look for a job. But again, here we see it's still much higher in the high meaning. So, so we're seeing a lot of things that, that the high meaning and low fairness is almost as bad as low meaning and low fairness. Not quite, but. And then let's look at the sectors. So I'm looking for overrepresentation in the sectors. And actually, I talked about this when we had the call before, Andrew. And actually, I decided to go back to a much larger survey. So 1,500 people. Once you split it by sectors, it's really hard to find statistical significance. You've only got about 100 people in each sector. So I went back to a much bigger survey. So this is now pre-COVID data. I don't believe it changes anything, but it's got 25,000 people in the sample. So we've got much better representation. So the ones that are in the miserable jobs are very overrepresented by hospitality and retail. So low meaning, low fairness. The ones in the high meaning, marketing, design, creative agencies are up there, and to an extent tech. Tech was definitely more pre-COVID than now. Tech's had quite a battering this last year, but that's where those jobs were. If you go to the low meaning, high fairness, they tend to be professional financial services. And any of you in HR came straight in there. Actually, because we had such a big sample, we had enough people in human resources to do it. And they were coming in that space of feeling that very fair, but not so meaningful. And then the ones that are high meaning, low fairness are not going to take you by surprise. Health, education, probably zookeeping in there too, but I don't have the data. But so those are the overrepresentations, and I think they make sense. We definitely see professional services. We have quite a lot of professional services and finance companies in our clients, and they tend to score slightly lower on Inspire than some of our other clients. So we're sort of seeing that across things. So this is when I say overrepresentation, doesn't mean everybody in these sectors don't have this. There'd be people who absolutely love their jobs, have got them both. It's just an overrepresentation of what's going on there. So that's just add a few more stats on it. I think that's my role in this webinar.
Before you take off the screen share, one of the things that I love about all these 2x2s is that they show us that one size fits none, right? That if we're talking about meaningful work, if we're talking about how do we create more meaning in the workplace, it really depends on which of these 4 quadrants. I happen to be in. Obviously, what we're going to do in marketing and tech, for example, with the people in marketing and tech who feel, high meaning and high fairness, it's going to be very different things than if we're focused on having conversations with people in hospitality or retail, which is going to be very different than if we're focused on having those conversations in the professional services or human resource HR professionals, which is going to be very different than if we're talking to a teacher or a nurse at one particular moment.
And it's even more than that, Andrew, because actually, if you look at, within firm data, we see, different parts of
Massive
the
differences.
Absolutely. As a statistician, we always talk about the idea of variation around the mean, that, the mean, the average can sometimes hide a lot of variation, and, there's the classic one that everyone used to talk about, is this U shape of age and happiness, that when you're in your middle age, you're the least happy, which of course, if you look at the pure effect of age, is absolutely true. But of course, you can find some very happy people in middle age, and you can find some very miserable people who are young or old, So there's always a lot of variation around what's going on. And it's why I always recommend to companies to measure themselves team by team, because they will have microcultures within the organization, different challenges within the organization. So sectors is the first unpacking we can do at a national level or an international level. Then you look at different firms in there, different hospitals, different schools, whatever, and you'd find very different things. And then you look within those and they'll be very different again. So it's sort of, it's variation all the way down. And of course, we all have good and bad weeks, let alone anything else. We go up and down too.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that I love about Friday Pulse is that actually creates, the tool creates visibility into those good and bad weeks, those individual differentiations, the team differentiations, the ability to be able to de-average is just so powerful.
So we've got a few here. So Steve says high meaning and high fairness, but you've only been there 3 weeks. Might have a honeymoon effect there, Steve. I don't know.
That's
how
right,
it
exactly.
Continues. Definitely find that people in the first 6 months, a year of employment in a new firm tend to be happier. High meaning, low fairness. Yeah, so you're in that zone. Trying to drive more meaning, but I need to drive very high fairness too. Fair enough. High meaning, low fairness makes sense. Yeah, I imagine people work hard and more likely to burn out. We definitely have those sort of effects. I'm going to hand back to you, Andrew. And I've just realized, we are chatting and we've got another 15 minutes of this webinar. So
that's great.
Over to you.
I'll power through what needs to go next.
Yeah.
I'm gonna very quickly hit on Jean-Pierre's question, which is like the difference between meaning and engagement and how to clearly define the differences.
Yeah.
And my short answer is, engagement can be defined in many different ways. In the psychological literature, as opposed to the organizational literature, engagement is usually defined as absorption or a sense of flow, really losing yourself in what you're doing, because you're finding it kind of fully maximizing the skills that you have is the right kind of challenge at hand. That would be how Csikszentmihalyi would define flow or engagement. Meaning, again, being a real sense of, is the work that I'm doing worthwhile and significant? So it's almost an external kind of perspective. Meaning is often, whereas engagement's a very deeply internalized thing where you almost lose your sense of self because you're so just focused and absorbed in what you're doing. I think that's one way within the literature.
Yeah, and if you're talking about engagement as it's used in management speak, then the reality is that engagement is really a code word for productivity. And so it's quite different than meaning.
Discretionary performance, loyalty to my organization, intent to stay is actually like the way that Gallup defines meaning.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to carry on some slides. Let me see, here we go. So we've kind of talked about what of meaningful work. We've talked about the so what of meaningful work. We've potentially looked at some kind of contemporary challenges and said, could these potentially be related to a sense of injustice around like meaning at work? Now this question is, what is just meaning at work? What is a kind of relationship and a focus on meaning that could include more fairness? And what would that look like? And again, there's lots of, especially social theorists, who have been thinking about these kinds of questions for hundreds of years. And usually the question comes down to like, well, just meaning at work would be freedom from certain things, like, people getting in the way of my capacity to do things, domination, physical harm, psychological harm, those kinds of things. But even more importantly, a sense of freedom too, a sense of autonomy and dignity in the work that I'm doing, the capacity to choose, to enact my values, to decide what is right or wrong, to realize my full potential, to develop my best self, to really pursue things that I think of as important. All of these things would be the kinds of things that that would look like what just meaning could be in the organization. And of course, somebody said at one point I was just an idealist. Well, Marx, let's go there. A just society, Marx would have said, was one where workers were actually empowered to just bring the very best of themselves, to develop and apply their innate skills, their capabilities, their desires within a community for the betterment of all. In some ways, just meaning would be enacting that kind of a capabilities approach in the way in which we think about being able to really harness and bring our very fullest potential to work for the betterment of all.
I'm a bit
yeah.
horrified because I'm thinking I look like Karl Marx now.
You do actually look an enormous amount like Karl Marx. It's actually,
I've quite got the full length of beard.
You do. You've got the whole.
I thought I was going for Father Christmas or Einstein. I'm obviously going for Karl Marx.
Not necessarily about that. How do you do it? So this is the question that I live in my work around all the time. It's like, these are nice things to say, but what does it actually mean to enact them? And I think that you really need to have a bit of a systems lens when you think about these things. You can't just do them in isolation. You need to we exist in societal context. And so again, we need to think about where we are. We also need to think about the organizational conditions that potentially enable us. And then I think we can think about individual strategies. And in my experience as a practitioner around this stuff, a lot of people dive right to the individual strategy and try to think about, okay, how do I increase meaning at the individual level? And I think that unless we see the individual as embedded within these broader structures, it's really hard to think that you're going to have significant and lasting change. And or even, I think more importantly, there's a risk of alienating the individual because they just feel really frustrated by being told that it's their responsibility to adjust their meaning and fairness levels, which can be challenging if you don't have any control in those regards. So what does any of this mean? In the societal context, I think that the International Labor Organization, which is part of the UN, says it well. Like, work is part of everyone's daily life, and it's crucial to our dignity, our well-being, and our development as human beings. We spend more time at work than doing anything other than sleeping in our lives. So it's important that we think about work's role in creating a sense of dignity. And there's a lot of jobs that are out there that David Graeber would call them bullshit jobs. There's crappy jobs. There's all sorts of different ways of being able to talk about this, but there's lots of jobs out there that are just not good work in the world. And so, we need to be able to address that. But I also think that there's a broader role for government to think about, well, what is good work, and how do we think about the role that organizations should play, and what kind of regulation and what kind of laws should exist. This is a document that the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy of the United States, just put out at the end of 2022. That's a framework for mental health and well-being in the workplace that I think is brilliant. And you'll see down in the bottom left of this actual framework that mattering at work, which is one of the big pillars, is all about the relationship between dignity and meaning. So I think that this is a great first step in a government saying, yes, like, this stuff's important. I think we also need laws, we need protection, we need some teeth, some legislation that actually ensures that organizations are thinking about, for example, making sure people have a living wage, are creating fairness, so that we can then focus on meaning as well.
So for us that can just go back, for us that aren't from North America, the US Surgeon General is like sort of head of public health in the US. Is that so?
He's the US's kind of chief doctor, would be the way to
okay, because he did a great statement earlier this year that loneliness is worse than smoking.
That's right.
It was really succinct, and it's something I've said for a long time, but it's really nice to see him coming out and saying that. Yeah,
it's really
I want this document, so we will put a link to this when we do the follow-up email, because I think that's quite interesting, actually, this document.
It's brilliant. This framework is really well done.
Yeah,
as a document. Organizational conditions. And Emma, I see your question. It's like, how I, as one individual, can I change the organizational conditions? So, I don't think as one individual we necessarily always can, but we can create a bit of a movement. It says that there's some wonderful stats. It's like it takes 24.7% of a population to create a movement. And so, you don't need everyone. You need maybe a coalition of the willing to do some of these kinds of things. Like, think about what are the culture and values that we uphold as organizations. The research says that organizations that have values like care or connection or mutuality or fairness or integrity or excellence, these are the kinds of values that tend to create the conditions for meaningful work in our organizations. But it's not just enough to have culture and values and nice things that go on the wall. We actually need to uphold them in our policies and practices. And so if you're an HR professional, you are really important here right now. How we hire people, how we reward people, how we promote people, how we fire people, how we downsize, all of these are wonderful moments where we can walk the talk or fail to walk the talk on this relationship between meaning and fairness at work. But then there's also the ways in which we accept behavior in the organization. So Mike Steger has done some wonderful work looking at all of the literature on what do leaders need to do, what kind of behavior should we expect of leaders who really role model what meaningful work and enable the conditions for meaningful work. And he has this great karma acronym that kind of describes the 5 most important things in terms of providing great transparency and clarity in what you're communicating, having an authentic relationship to your own values and what's important and meaningful for you, truly creating conditions of respect and trust within the workplace, having the opportunities to recognize people and make sure that they know that they matter, and creating a kind of autonomy support as a leader, knowing that it's actually a lot of work to help people do and choose their own adventures, and to be able to do that well as a manager is actually a really important set of skills.
Yeah, autonomy supportive is a really interesting thing, because you almost have to give up some of your own autonomy to support the autonomy of others. It's a really interesting tension in leadership, and indeed parenting. If you ever parented a teenager, you definitely get into this tension between autonomy, your autonomy, and the teenagers. So that's a really interesting one. Yeah.
Of course, if you've done a good job at that organizational level, if you exist in a society that creates these conditions, then it's a lot easier to talk about the individual strategies. Now, of course, these individual strategies can happen even if those other things don't exist. It's just I think chances of success are a hell of a lot higher if all of these things are working in tandem. So what do those individual strategies look like? Well, you could probably break them down into 3 major factors. One is this fancy psychological term, dispositional signatures, which just basically means how do I help someone understand what their strengths are, what their talents are, what the skills are that they are bringing to the table that can allow them both a sense of flow and a sense of I'm bringing the best of myself to do something important. That's a really important aspect of helping an individual create more meaning for themselves. 2 is really thinking about the ways in which I craft my job to be able to have the right kinds of goals, to think about what's going to motivate me to do what Amy Rosneski calls as job crafting, where I really deliberately reorient my job to take advantage of all those skills and strengths and traits that I bring to the table. Then the last thing that I can do is actually just tell different stories. So much of meaning comes down to the stories that we tell about our organizations and ourselves. And in even horrible jobs and really crappy jobs, people can still reframe what might be happening. They can still recalibrate. They can still refocus on different parts of the job that actually give them a tremendous sense of meaning. And Nic, you talked about the fact that, even in contexts and in situations where there's no good right for someone to see that their work as meaningful. People do find great meaning, and it's because of the stories that they tell about what's going on. And so there's definitely ways we can take advantage of all those three things.
Most certainly. That's really helpful, Andrew. Is that the end of your slides? I've forgotten.
Yeah, and then the last thing I'll just say is like a quick plug for the World Congress. If you're interested in any of this stuff, there's this wonderful International World Congress on Positive Psychology that's happening in July in Vancouver, and you should come. I'm one of the co-chairs of it. So that's my plug. That's my like shameless plug for the World Congress.
No, that's not shameless. It's a great thing. I haven't been for about a decade to Positive Psychology conference, but I always love them. And some come to Europe sometimes, don't they? So is it normally every other time in Europe?
That's right. Yeah, every other year is in Europe.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So look, everyone, it's 7 minutes to. I know Andrew has to go on a hard end, but and hello, Angela. We'd love to have some questions. Angela, would you, before everyone pops off, would you put the just poll? We just like to just take data on how much you've enjoyed or not enjoyed the webinar. We're not allowed to answer, Andrew, you and me, because that would bias the sample. But that's really helpful. We just track that and see what works. And but I would, if people have got questions for Andrew or myself, then please ask your questions now. I have to say again, Andrew, whenever I talk with you, I learn something, and there's much to digest from that. And I'm going to have the wonderful task of trying to summarize it in an email follow-up. So that will be a task tomorrow, because it's very rich and there's a lot of stuff in there. So, but for me, it's really interesting thinking about the tension between things, because, everything sort of, there is an alignment, there's a total alignment between, our own personal well-being and happiness and organizational things. But sometimes it's off the tangents, and it doesn't. And I think those are interesting things to explore, because that's where people like you intervene. I mean, you work with organizations, don't you, to design a system which basically helps more meaning flow in a sustainable and fair way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we've worked together with clients a couple of times, which is really good. So, any questions? I can see some comments going. Have you got any questions, Angela?
There's a couple of comments coming in, which are really nice. Just sharing some love. I'd really like to know from both of you where you find the most meaning in your work.
For me, my whole career has been about meaning. I was rather fortunate to inherit a bit of money in my 20s, and so I got very much into what can I do that is meaningful, because I mean, although it was lovely to inherit money, and it was, don't want to say it wasn't meaning. And so I realized there was this absence. So I actually think my whole career has been about how do I do something meaningful? And of course, that's the statistical contribution I make, because that's my, what did you say, signature thing? You said signature
disposition.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of my skills is definitely statistics, and how to communicate them. So I kind of decided that statistics were my weapon of choice in trying to create a fairer and happier world. I think is what it's become. So I think everything I've ever tried to do is very meaning-led, actually. Probably you too. You've been into academia. Yeah. You're not looking after the money, are you?
No, I mean, for me, I think that it's the central question that I have been asking in my life for years is, how do you design the conditions where people can bring the most meaning into their lives? And I think I've tried to do that in lots of different ways. I used to work in the arts. I used to work in philanthropy. I used to work in marketing, worked in talent management and coaching, culture change. I mean, all of those things I think were, if I look back through the rearview mirror, were all about how do I help someone kind of touch that, words that I would use today, eudaimonic button inside of us all that allows us to connect to that meaning.
I think it's a very important driver for you, isn't it, Angela?
Yes, definitely helping people.
Yeah, I mean, you used to work in a charity before you worked with us, didn't you?
Yeah, many years in the charity sector.
Yeah, and you've
still volunteer in the charity sector.
Yeah, she's crazy enough to be on the board of a charity. So I think you're working out something other than take notes in a meeting, don't you? But she's very generous with her time, Angela. So yeah, she's a great advocate for this whole space. Well, there's a lot of love here, Andrew. I mean, I absolutely love that webinar. I'll obviously look at the data and see whether the bid, because I'm a statistician and I'll look at that. But I really want to thank you for joining me today. And I hope the conference goes really well next month. And I look forward to working together with you on future projects.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Angela. It's been a pleasure.
Big shout out for you. And thank you everyone for the contributions and the chat. It felt, yeah,